This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with bite.
History? History? We don't have no stinking history. Oh wait, yeah we do.
Hi, my name is Alison Tieman, and I'm the founder of Honey Badger Radio. My early introduction to men's issues came from my mother, who gave me the book The Princess at the Window. From there, I started studying men's issues at my local university library and ended up applying and being accepted into an undergraduate program in science there. I continued to pursue my studies into men's issues for several years, and eventually, through my university computer access, I began to explore the online world of men's issues in soc.men, a Usenet news group devoted to discussing issues affecting men. At the time, starting with soc.men, I was a fence-sitter, one of those people who smugly said things like men's rights activists are exactly the same as feminists. But as I interacted on soc.men, my attitude started to change, and I was eventually invited to Stand Your Ground, a web forum created by one of the early online men's rights pioneers. My thinking when I was part of Stand Your Ground was still very binary. I no longer equated men's rights activists in the West with feminists, but I thought that the West was misandrous in the same way that Muslims were misogynist. At Stand Your Ground, I described how some Muslim men would refuse to touch women for fear that they were menstruating, thus dirty, and how that paralleled my father's experience with lesbian separatists at my mother's feminist rallies, when he volunteered to bartend, and how those lesbian separatists refused to touch any drinks my father had poured for them. I still had that two poles with myself in the middle thinking, except now I was between the men-hating West and the woman-hating Middle East. At the same time, I was beginning to be concerned about how angry and hateful I was becoming, mostly at Western women, but also at Muslim men. A few years later, I stumbled over a blog, Feminist Critics, created by several liberal men's issues enthusiasts, one of whom identifies as a feminist. Feminist Critics was a turning point in my thinking. One of the bloggers, his screen name is Ballgame, it's still there as far as I know, studied violence in the Middle East extensively and found that the more control an aggressor had over the victims of his violence, the less likely he was to choose to direct it at women. Even in the Middle East, just like the West, criminals and terrorists prefer to do violence to men over women. That, and happening on a strange quote I don't remember the source of, a quote that said, "The men and women of every era and every country deserve each other," set me on a different path, away from my radical centrism. I started to think less in terms of sides, men versus women, West versus East, and more in terms of gender dynamics and how they function together to create society, how men and women function together to create society. I started a blog called Gender Attic, and I explored the situation for men and how the situation for men is tied to the situation for women, and vice versa. I started to suspect using words like oppression when it comes to sex roles was a way of hiding the truth, which is far more complex and points to the interdependence of both men and women psychologically as well as physically. About the time I started up Gender Attic, I also started posting on Reddit's men's rights board. In 2012, the SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, declared the men's rights movement a hate movement. It then walked its declaration back in 2012, but has since reinstated it in 2018. In the beginning of 2012, I didn't identify as a men's rights activist or a feminist or anything really. But when the SPLC made its decision to start targeting the men's rights movement, some men in men's rights Reddit, who had only ever had support for their issues from the men's rights movement, took it very hard. There was a rash of men talking about suicide. And I remember that day very clearly when I started to see the comments appear contemplating suicide because they were part of something that was being profoundly ostracized. They had taken strength from something that was being thrown out and being made into something that was beyond the pale, something evil. And I remember those comments, and I remember being so desperate to do something, anything. And the only thing I could think to do was to start to identify as a men's rights activist, so that if the SPLC chose to throw them away and ostracize them and stigmatize them and call them evil and not worthy of being considered human, then it would be doing the same to me as well. There was one user whose account was never heard from again. We still don't know if he committed suicide. It was discovered after some digging that a suicide had occurred at his location on the same date, but we never knew if it was him. That's when I chose to call myself a men's rights activist. Not because I believed or agreed with any orthodoxy, which I don't think there really is one, but because if the SPLC chose to cast those men, my fellow travelers, into the dark, then I decided it could do the same to me as well. And that's how I came to the men's rights side. From a smug centrist declaring that men's rights activists and feminists are the same, eventually I came to realize that they weren't. No matter what feminists do, they can do no wrong, and no matter what feminists do right, they can do no right. And as long as people can't advocate for men's rights as freely as they do women's, I'll call myself a men's rights activist.
I found the men's movement entirely by accident. Back in 2008, I was writing erotica for women, and part of managing my career and keeping up with publisher and industry news had me participating on several romance and erotica writers' boards and review websites. These sites were infested with feminists of the newly emerging intersectional variety. I recall leaving a comment on one popular site on a post that was heavily pro-feminism to remark that I was not a feminist. Some 350 furious, excoriating replies later, I gave up trying to defend my position as an equalist and just let them keep screaming at me until they finally got bored and stopped. So there I was, on the same site, if I recall, and someone made a post linking to a men's website with the suggestion that all of us empowered women ought to go over there and take these sexist, chauvinist, misogynist, whiny man-babies down a peg or two. Out of curiosity, I clicked over and read the article, which frankly did come across as complaining and over-trivial. The feminization of science fiction. The basic grievance was as follows. Men like hard sci-fi. You can't find hard sci-fi anymore, whether in books, TV, or movies, because there always has to be a romantic subplot or something in there to make it appeal to women. Why, oh why, can't women just leave men's stuff alone? Generalizations as to what men like and women like aside, I scrolled down to the comments section, where I saw the most interesting thing. The feminists from the review site, those denouncers of sexism and sexual shaming and sexual stereotyping and all things similar, and who in so many of their own comments decried toxic masculinity, the boys don't cry mentality, the alpha-hole romance hero, and the lack of appreciation for vulnerability in men when it came to the cardboard cutout characters in popular romance fiction, they were all there calling the author a whiny man-baby who needed to man up, shut up, and stop complaining. The very feminist readers and writers I knew who objected to the traditional gender roles, who promoted body positivity within the genre, who vociferously condemned virgin shaming and slut-shaming and cramming people into gendered boxes, there they were, all over the comments, calling the male commenters there fat, ugly, neck-bearded losers who couldn't get laid, not real men, and virgins who were just bitter because no woman would touch their tiny little micro-penises. Now this hardly surprised me. It wasn't news to me that feminists are frequently hypocrites on an epic scale, that they preach one thing and practice another. What did surprise me was that the guys in the comments were having none of it. There were no yes dears that day. They didn't try to explain themselves either. They simply called out every sexist shaming comment for exactly what it was, and continued to discuss amongst themselves The Conundrum of Feminized Science Fiction. I was intrigued. Long after the feminists had mostly exhausted themselves against the brick wall of these male commenters, I stayed reading the discussion. Eventually, one commenter mentioned that the new Star Trek was pretty good. He'd ripped it off the internet and watched it 10 times. I jumped in and asked him, "Well, who the hell is going to pay $300 million to make a movie for you, you idiot? Why would anyone make movies that only appeal to the people least likely to pay for them? At least your girlfriend would drag you to the theater on date night or buy the director's cut DVD if there's something in the movie for her. But they're not going to spend huge sums of money making shit for people who are just going to steal it." Now, despite my admittedly harsh tone and the fact that I made no secret of the fact that I was female, my comment was taken seriously, and the consensus was that I had a point. Thus began my experience of a truly masculine conversation space, one where women were welcome right up until they demanded special treatment because vagina, at which point they were shown the door. I loved every minute of it. I stayed for months on that website listening to the things men don't say to women, especially not the women in their lives, learning their perspectives, their struggles, their virtues, and their flaws, and also learning about the challenges and disadvantages they face in family court, in criminal court, at work, at home, and with women. I learned a lot about myself there, and a lot about the part I played in the breakdown of my own marriage. I also learned about the many significant forms of institutional discrimination against men and boys, and once I'd seen that, well, there just was no way I could go along with my life and not say something. So I did say something. A lot of things, actually. And here I am.
I was an anti-feminist as soon as I knew what feminism was. You could probably have called me an anti-feminist before then because I was a mouthy little brat and a somewhat obsessive busybody with what some would have called an overdeveloped sense of fairness. I wouldn't have told you I was an anti-feminist at the time or had any inkling that my attitude had a label. I wouldn't have cared if I'd found out it did either. It was going to be my attitude regardless. That said, I never really had to confront the possibility of getting taken in by feminist rhetoric. I was fortunate enough to learn feminism's nature and have plenty of time to recognize the nature of the men and boys around me before encountering much in the way of the ideology at all. So I was kind of immune to it. What I wasn't immune to was a growing awareness of at least the social side and eventually the legal aspects of what I now know to be gynocentric culture. What I guess most people would think of if I said chivalry. Or traditionalism. The cooperative expectations placed on the two sexes. There are two different sets of messages I received about my end of that bargain. Those from my family, which involved reciprocating considerations with compassion, gratitude, caregiving, and mindfulness, versus those of society, which increasingly seemed to mandate resenting the consideration I received as a girl and any reciprocation that might be expected of me. Being the argumentative busybody that I am, the double standards to which I was witness became fodder for arguments, and years later when I had consistent internet access, for online debate. I posted in political message boards railing against panic narratives being used to push the Violence Against Women Act, an unnecessary gendering of existing domestic violence law. I ranted about the double standard it represented, and was immediately branded a man by offended feminists. That was apparently supposed to pass for a counter-argument. Then what I'd been afraid of started hitting people I knew. Two of my friends, at 2 different times in 2 different counties, with 2 totally different circumstances, were convicted of assault for defending themselves against female assailants. One had his conviction overturned on appeal. The other was too demoralized by his treatment in the courtroom to even try. That was when I started writing to my state legislators about due process issues. But because I mistook the problem with VAWA for it just being gendered, I didn't get far. Later, I married a divorcee, and his ex-wife began engaging in custody interference. As this was happening to us, another friend of ours went through his own ordeal as the state continued to garnish his wages for child support and send it to his ex-wife for several months after he obtained custody of his children. To try to find out what we could do about these problems, I began researching information on custody and father's rights online. Our friend's solution came automatically when the Child Support Enforcement Agency finally caught up to the reality of his custody situation. However, he had no recourse to get that 6 months' support back. At the same time, there wasn't a lot of readily available information that would help us with our situation beyond hammering home the importance of legal representation. We figured out that when the ex took the kids and fled to the far end of the state, we were going to have to move or my husband would lose contact with his kids. That research did lead me to an awareness that online men's issues discussion was a thing. It wasn't a discussion I contributed to aside from adding to the plethora of stepmoms expressing their outrage over ex-wives' cruel use of their kids as weapons. But I knew men were aware of and discussing more than just custody and child support issues. I got involved with the case that led me to the men's rights movement, in part because moving put us right where that case was happening, and in part because the victim had married one of my best friends. Even after everything I'd seen, if anyone else had started telling me about her husband's crazy ex-wife's behavior, I'd have thought they were engaging in hyperbole. It started with the usual petty woman scorn stuff, but quickly escalated into what would become a 7-year ordeal of malicious prosecution and vexatious litigation. The false allegations ranged from as serious as rape to as frivolous as a restraining order violation via drive-by greeting in a public place. And yes, that was a real accusation she made. In the midst of this, one of my childhood friends, again in a different county, began experiencing a very similar ordeal. I was unable to be there for him directly because of distance, but continually shared information I was learning from my other friend's case in the hopes that that would help him. I also began researching more into the law, discovering just how messed up the Violence Against Women Act really is, and writing about the case as a way of sharing information about the way due process rights had been impacted by this law. To help make sure that the writing was seen so that more people would know, I learned about social bookmarking, and that's how I found Reddit's men's rights subreddit. I continued to share my first writing about the case until the vexatious litigant herself found my writing and threatened to sue the site that had published it. The resulting brouhaha led me to reconsider how I was approaching covering the case, and I switched from a narrative about the experience itself to advice on how to handle the behavior involved. That got the personal blog I started in order to publish that advice pinned to the sidebar of the men's rights subreddit. Reddit is where I got labeled an MRA, not because I was going to court with a falsely accused man, but because I posted in that subreddit. I saw the term being used by Reddit feminists as a slur against men who were there to discuss valid human rights issues. I hadn't made it a point to draw attention to my sex, so whenever I encountered a disapproving feminist in the sub, there was no salesmanship, only condemnation and shaming. Then I found out I was on a list being widely used by regulars in the feminist subreddits to identify users of the men's rights subreddit whenever we posted on the site, so they could be sure to determine their view of anything we posted through the filter of their hatred for MRAs. That's when I accepted the label. I thought, screw you guys. If you're going to use it as a condemnation for things I know are right, then you can condemn me right along with the rest. Reddit is where I first encountered Alison and Karen, also. I kept running across their posts on the site, then their videos, and their blogs. It had been awesome to find a site to discuss these issues in the first place, and it was awesome all over again to find other women there who got it. Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 31, Once Upon a Badger. I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with our fearless leader, Alison Tieman, and Woozle Slayer, Karen Straughan, to take a little trip down memory lane. We're taking a break from the Accountability Gap series to go over a little history because even in the few years we've been doing what we do, our group and our audience has grown and changed. We wanted to talk a little bit about where we came from, where we're coming from, and how this whole thing got started. But before we get on to today's topic, a couple of reminders. If you're on YouTube and it starts experiencing platform malfunction syndrome and it won't let you listen, remember we're also on Twitch and Facebook, and those platforms might be a little easier to watch. And we do that because you can't keep a good badger down. If you want to be sure you'll always catch our live streams, even if YouTube decides to throw us in the gulag for Ron Think, and one of our channels is in there right now. Or if you want to catch our show in its audio format, remember to go to badgerfeed.com and register to receive notifications. Also, we're still raising funds to get our witnesses back to the courtroom for one more round against our opponent's fancy schmancy New York lawyer. So if you want to help us with that, you can donate at feedthebadger.com. And with that, back to our regular subject. Our opening brought us up to Reddit's men's rights subreddit where we met. Alison, sorry guys, I'm having really bad allergies today. Alison and Karen have survived Reddit's censors, but I'm more confrontational in case you haven't noticed. And I've been shadow banned there 5 times. 4 for posting about the 7 years in hell case, and once just for being an MRA. I had begun posting there in about 2005 or 2006. Then I lost internet access for about a year, and when I returned, Karen was there. It wasn't too long after that, after I started seeing her posts, that I also began noticing Alison's posts. And we were all just kind of there, mostly agreeing, but not yet in cahoots, so to speak, until 2 incidents brought our commonalities into sharp focus. The first one started with a group of self-titled lady MRAs inflicting on the men's rights discussion one of the few things that comes about as close as you can get to triggering me, not to panic, but to peak frustration. A variation on the question, more of a demand, "Don't you respect women?" It was asked in response to a description detailing the various facets of the manosphere, given in response to a discussion on that topic by a man who was a 20-year veteran of the movement and a victim of multiple false allegations. The lady MRA mods took offense, accused him of the high crime of misogynies, lashed out at him, and then asked the men's rights subreddit subscribers to weigh in on the conflict. That did not go as they had planned. The other was an article by prominent feminist critic Kathy Young, acknowledging issues faced by men and boys, then castigating the men's rights movement, and especially A Voice for Men, for talking about them without the added measure of coddling women's sensibilities. There were always going to be women's voices in the men's rights movement. Women are busybodies by nature. It's what we do. And women and men are, no matter what feminists tell you, connected. There were always going to be women who recognized the need for reform, and there were always going to be women who talked about it. The 2 incidents made it obvious that there were 2 camps, however. Those who did the normal female thing of entering a male-dominated area and deciding it has to be changed to suit their attitudes and sensibilities, and those who deal with the environment as it is, the issues as they stand, and the unadulterated nature of what activism is needed. We knew women's voices had the potential to open people's ears to men's issues that were being dismissed as misogyny, whining, etc., when raised by men. We knew that women's sensibilities could stifle the criticism of law and policy that allows female dysfunction to result in harm to men and boys around them. We decided it was important, therefore, for women who could approach this discussion without occupying a standpoint that begins with blaming and shaming men, without occupying a gynocentric standpoint, to make ourselves heard. That was when we united. But Honey Badger Radio came along after that. This was really Alison's baby.
All right. I assume that's the intro?
That's the intro.
Cue Alison.
Cue Alison.
Tell us more about yourself, Alison. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about your father. Tell me about all of your issues. Tell me, is a cigar really just a cigar?
Tell me about your mother. Well, in the context of this, she was actually the one who got me into men's rights by giving me the book, The Princess at the Window. I know that's actually surprising to a lot of feminists who assume that my mother got me into men's issues for the opposite reason, which is that, I don't know, she was abusive or we had a troubled relationship, which was true. But I'm at the stage in my life where my mother did die in 2007 of lung cancer. And I don't really want to live the rest of my life stuck in having been abused, having had a rough, difficult relationship with my mother. And I'd rather look back and see her as somebody who had almost no moral cowardice, someone who stood by her principles, someone who fought And to give you an idea of my mother's personality, when my mother and my father were first together and they had me in tow, they were a very poor family in the 70s, and they used to have to go to a public laundromat in a really rough part of town. And one day they were in this laundromat, and somebody had put in some clothing, and the clothing was done. It was cleaned, and the washer had completed its cycle. So my father went in, and he's like, when this is the only one that was available. So he took out the wet clothes and just put them on the folding area. And then they proceeded to put their own clothing in to wash it. And about 30 seconds after he did this gigantic Hell's Angel type just went screaming into the laundry room and started to yell his head off at my father and tell him that he was going to beat the shit out of him for touching his clothing. And my mother marched right up to him, looked him square in the eye and said, "Is this what you want to do with your life?" And the guy was so flummoxed, he just went back to the bar he'd been because it was the laundromat was by a bar. He just went right back and was like, just continued to drink. So that was the kind of woman my mother was. She never backed down from a fight. I never saw her with a single ounce of moral cowardice. She was admirable in that sense. We had our difficulties, but like I said, I'm at the stage in my life where I choose to look at that and say, she was the one that got me into men's rights, which has been by far the biggest and most positive influence in terms of a philosophy or a movement in my life. And she was also the one who set that standard of standing up for yourself, even in the face of a bully, even in the face of an entire movement that bullies. So, that's what I would say about my mother. And about how I got into Honey Badger Radio, ever since I've been part of this, and even in the online world, part of the online men's rights movement, I always had this desire to find other women who I could see were struggling with these issues in the way I was, because I didn't just externalize these issues. I didn't just say, oh, this is the problem of feminism. This is the problem of, the family courts. This is the problem of the government. I internalized them, and I said, these problems start with my approach to the world around me and how I've learned to approach the world around me. And if I'm going to really change anything, it needs to start with my own attitude towards men and my own attitude towards myself. And I had seen, when I was in these online communities, I'd seen there were lots of women who participated. Not lots, but there was a certain amount of women who participated, more than probably feminists would expect. But they all had that same attitude that when they went into the space should conform to them, and men should be expected to abide by their sensibilities and their moral decision, or their offense and their emotions, and that men should hold their tongue if they were uncomfortable. And they didn't. The women that I was encountering still had that attitude that they should be the ones to set the moral tone of a space or set the moral tone of a society. And it's not like I believe that men should set the moral. I think that it should be an equal thing. But right now in our society, and for a very long time, women have been the ones who've decided what's rude, what's offensive, what can be spoken of, what is moral. And that was something that I didn't see the women involved in these online spaces were really challenging. That need to control the moral landscape of the space. And so I would find these women, I'd be excited, and then I'd say, oh, they still have that same problem. They still have that expectation that the men around them, tiptoe around their emotions and their sense of offense. And I was looking and looking and looking, and I was still, even at the time, I was also thinking, I want to have women I respect. I want to feel like I can see women who are like that, those positive aspects of my mother, and I'm not seeing them anywhere. I remember on sock.men, there was this article where they were talking about female military personnel getting pregnant and then having abortions, getting pregnant, getting out of active duty, and then having abortions afterwards. And I was reading this and I felt so betrayed by the feminists who weren't holding those women to the same standard that was expected of the male soldiers. I mean, for a male soldier, if you go on leave and get a sunburn, you can get written up. You get a fine for damaging government property. That's what the abbreviation for soldier means. It means government property, a government issue, government property, GI, government issue, government property. So a male soldier can get in trouble for getting a sunburn, and these soldiers, female soldiers, were getting pregnant and just being allowed to leave and allowed to destroy the morale and the cohesion of their unit. And the feminists talking about this did nothing but just excuse it. It was like, no, you need to hold these women to the same standard the men are held to. And this kind of thing, just, I wanted to find women who at the very least would expect other women and hold themselves to these standards of responsibility. So I was looking. And it wasn't till I got to Men's Rights Reddit and I started to see another woman who I could see was engaging with the material in a similar way to myself, and even struggling with it in a similar way to myself. And that was actually Karen. There was these posts that I saw where she would post, and it would be obvious to me that she was internalizing a lot of the things that were being talked about in the way that I had as well. And so that's where I first met Karen. And then I remember the first message, I was like, I messaged her because I was so excited to have found another woman who was showing the same signs of internalizing these issues that I recognized in myself. And I said, would you like to read my webcomic, Karen? Or no, I didn't even know her name at the time. Girl Writes What? Would you like to read my webcomic? Oh, I don't even know if you remember that.
I don't actually. I remember you. I remember your comments. Like, I remember your comments always came across as more harsh than mine, or at least than I believe mine did. Maybe because you were at this longer and you had less patience for like sort of hand holding people through the ideas and stuff. So often you would leave a comment and somebody would, even a man, would respond in a negative way, and I would be like, okay, here's the thing, right? Here's what I think she's getting at, right? And then I would go and explain it in a little more detail and be like, this is just what I think, right? You know, and but you always came across as like hardcore in your in your text comments. You really don't come across as hardcore in person. You come across as an extremely gentle, thoughtful person in person. But in your comments on Reddit, at least at that point, you came across as like, yeah, no, I'm not holding your hand, noob. Clean out your headgear. I'm just going to say this shit, right? And you can either accept it or run away. And I absolutely adored that about you, because it was just like, holy shit, right? Like, this is actually kind of like being back on that men's website. This is actually kind of, and like I said in my little intro, I really loved my time there. I absolutely loved every moment of my time there. I loved being held accountable for what I said. I loved being challenged on what I said. I loved never being cut any slack. I loved the idea of, and to be honest, and to be perfectly honest, I loved seeing the other women end up being shown the door. And I mean, that seems petty, and yeah, it probably is, right? But the other women who just couldn't hack the space, right, being shown the door. I loved the fact, not the fact that there were, you know, that the other women on the site were unable to hack it, but that when they showed that they were unable to take it, they were unable to tolerate the rough and tumble nature of that space, right? That they would get the boot, right? They would be told to get lost, don't come back, right? And I don't even think that they were banned or blocked or anything. They were just told, fuck off, right? You're done here. You have no more credibility here. You're done, right? You can come back and comment, but nobody's going to take you seriously because you're done, right? And I really loved that arena. I absolutely did. And some of it really did have to do with, and one of the things that I told, I've told BuzzFeed, and I've told Vice, and I've told, CBC, and I've told a bunch of people who have sort of reached out and asked me if I do things for them, right? Interview for them. One of the things that I've told them is, like, when you decide to end a marriage, whether you're male or female, I can guarantee you can, like, itemize every single fucking thing your partner did wrong, right? Over the past 15 years, you can list that out. You can make a detailed inventory of every single thing they fucked up, right? But what I wanted to know, and one of the things that kept me on that website, was my mother and my father, to equal degrees, having instilled in me this sense that, you're the only person you can control. And so when things go wrong in your life, it's actually a really good idea to see if there was something that you did, right? So that you can avoid doing that again. And so when my marriage fell apart, and it was at the point where I was like, okay, divorce is the only option for both of us, because we were both absolutely miserable. And even the kids were miserable. The kids were so miserable that their grades went up after we separated. So it was a really egregious situation, right? And I had that list of every single fucking thing he did wrong through the entire course of our marriage. It was, like, all fresh in my mind. It was like I could have just rattled it off. It would have taken me 2 hours to just rattle off every single thing he had done, right? But what I didn't have was a list of things that I had done wrong. And one of the things that, being in that very, very masculine space where men were talking about things that they don't tend to talk about in front of or to women, was it helped me get an understanding of the things that I had done wrong, the ways that I had contributed to the breakdown of the marriage, the ways that I had undermined my husband's masculinity, the ways that I had made him feel less relevant than he should have in his own family, in his own house, and all of those things, right? So I looked at that space, that really, really, really rough space, as an opportunity to learn. And I think that that's probably why they welcomed me in. And that's why I stayed, was because I felt like I had things to learn. And I think that there's maybe a humility there that not everybody has. And I know that not all women have it, not all men have it. And I saw, in the Lady MRA's subreddit that Hannah was mentioning, I saw a lot of this, these women who just come in and they, it seems like they are willing to acknowledge that men have issues, but they are not willing, if you can't be polite about it, then don't count on my support. Or if you can't be nice about it, then don't count on my support. Even though, oh yes, I fully believe that you are being disenfranchised. I fully believe that you are being damaged by the system unfairly, unjustly. I fully believe, but if you can't ask me nicely and stroke my ego and praise me and do all of these things, right, then don't count on my support because it's just not that important to me, right? And that was what really got me with the Lady MRA's subreddit, was this idea that, and we tried, didn't we, Alison? We tried to sort of start the FemRA subreddit.
Yeah.
We tried to start that to be the rough and tumble space, right, for women to discuss men's issues. And it's completely, it's defunct, right? Because the place where we need to be discussing it as women who can handle the conversation is in the men's rights subreddit.
Yeah, I kind of feel like it was started more to show that there was that divide between women and the men's rights movement. It never really felt like it was intended to become a hub, a place that would be used for a lot of discussion. I mean, there were posts in it and everything, but it really, at the time that it was started, and it wasn't started specifically by us, although we were involved in it. It was actually started by, oh shoot, I can't think of his name.
Stoned One.
Yeah, Stoned One. He was awesome, and he was really awesome in the discussion that led to that getting started as well. But it was really more of an example, and the FE was sort of a pun, which I liked that, because Fe is the symbol, the chemical name, in the periodic table of elements for iron, and so it was about strength, it was about guts, and actually the honey badger was in the image that was used as a sort of avatar for that subreddit. I believe it was eating a princess hat, but in any case, no, it wasn't so much intended to be a special space for females as it was to indicate that a feminine centric, a gynocentric special space for females in the men's rights movement wasn't really needed. And it did it through us not really being in there, because we were busy posting in the men's rights subreddit with the men and taking their criticism and giving information when we had information and backing them up when other women came in to call their tone of their complaints misogynistic, or the nature of their complaints misogynistic. I think the thing that probably pissed me off the most about the approach some of the other women that came into the men's rights subreddit had was, if you talk about something that women do as a, this is a common behavior among women, and this is the impact of it, and this is how, when it becomes dysfunctional, it's damaging, and this is how the law supports that dysfunction. And they would take it personally. I don't do that, therefore it's not a female behavior. And they would go off and get on their high horse and start lecturing people and calling them misogynistic. But they have no problem saying things like, men don't ask for directions, or all men are clods, or men don't understand consent, which is bullshit. All of it's bullshit. And it was perfectly all right for them to generalize, because they didn't mean all men, they just meant the men they were complaining about. And it was such a hypocritical thing. And to come into a men's space and do it was, in my opinion, just an absolute egregious breach of, not to use a TV term, but social protocol, because they wouldn't allow that in their subreddits. They wouldn't allow that in their spaces. In fact, they banned people left and right from the feminist subreddits for even questioning the narrative. And yet they expected to be able to come into the men's rights subreddit and lecture the men on, how they complained about something that happened to them, how they complained about the patterns of behavior that have caused the issues that they were discussing, and the impact of the way women in general treat men in general on men and boys. And that was one of the reasons I didn't really, when I first started posting in there, I don't even remember my original Reddit. It was Shadow something, and it was basically because I had to stay anonymous because the vexatious litigant threatened every witness that her victim had with various things. And with my family, it was I'm going to report you to I'm going to false report you to Child Protective Services. But I mean, when I went in there, I didn't go in there to be female and be feminine and say, hey, everybody, I'm a girl and I support you. It was, hey, these things are happening and these are my thoughts on them. And this is what we figured out. You know, and I talked about the importance of documentation being key to court cases and being key to defending yourself against accusations and things like that. That was what I was there for. So my sex didn't really matter. It was completely irrelevant to the subject at hand, you know, and it really didn't become obvious to most people until I started talking about my marriage. And then they were like, okay, is this a gay man or a woman talking about a husband? And that's how people found out that, because by that time I was Onero's Grip. My first 4 shadow bans of the 5 happened in fairly rapid succession over the course of a couple of years' visits. And then once I had changed my name to Onero's Grip and sort of built up a history on other subreddits and went back to the men's rights subreddit, it took years again before I was shadow banned again. When they started figuring out that I was female, I kind of expected, you know, there to be a bunch of, oh, well, that explains a lot. Instead, there were a bunch of the women that were shocked. I can't believe a woman would talk like you. I can't believe a woman would say the things that you say about female sensibilities and about this is not about you and about the dangers of believing women who make accusations and so on. Well, you know, if they'd come from where I was coming from, then they would understand. You can't watch man after man and boy after boy in your life go through ordeals involving false accusations and malicious prosecution and basically using accusations as a form of abuse against him and not recognize the danger of the believe the woman narrative. It becomes blatantly obvious when you see it striking people down around you and you see it taking up huge segments of their lives. I mean, my friend from the county where I grew up, my childhood friend, his ordeal was as long as you get to be a underage person, a kid. His ordeal lasted as long as you get to be a kid, from a point in his adult life to another point in his adult life. That amount of time. And like, you can't watch something like that and not recognize that you can't tolerate the idea of women can't lie, women can't do any wrong, women can't be considered abusive. So for me, it's always been about recognizing the issues, recognizing the causes behind the issues, and looking at what can be done to mitigate the issues, what can be done to protect men from these types of abuses and from the damage that they do in their lives, and to protect children from the damage that they do in their lives. And it's never really been about women for me at all.
So this is the conversation that we're having is essentially the beginnings of how the three of us met and where we met, which was on Men's Rights Reddit. And for those of you who don't know what Reddit is, it's basically a forum on which an internet forum where you can post a comment and reply to that comment in a series of threaded comment threads. So it's sort of like Facebook. You might have an original poster, put something up.
It's a link aggregator site, really.
Yeah, I'll link Aggregator site, but it's sort of like Facebook. You have an original post, and then people will post comments, and then people will post comments to those comments. So it's a discussion site, and that would be the first place where me, Karen, and Hannah ever encountered each other. And as Hannah was saying, she got into men's rights because of all of the false allegations that she had seen against men and boys in her life. And I got into men's rights because my mother showed me a book once. And Karen just got into men's rights through romance novels.
Erotica.
Sorry. I apologize. I didn't mean to impugn your honor.
Yeah, no, I write porn for women. There you go.
Yeah. And I've read it, and I'm actually amazed that women can't be honest about what they want.
No, they really, really can't. Yeah, no, if you look at the sales numbers for different genres, subgenres of porn for women, it's dominant male, submissive female, top seller, 2 dominant males, 1 submissive female, second top seller, right? Dominant male, 2 submissive females, or 1 dominant female and a submissive female, right? With a dominant male, that's the next one. Dominant male, submissive male, that's the next one. Dominant female, submissive female, that's the next one. Way at the very fucking bottom. Dominant female and submissive male. That's the one that sells the least.
And the
women just can't be honest about what they want.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was one, oh, I remember her name. I spoke of her like a couple episodes ago, but Clarice Thorne, she wrote an article on her blog bemoaning the fact that feminist men were unattractive to her. And she's like, you're being honest. That's good. It'd be nice if you didn't encourage men to be unattractive to women and then sort of lie about it.
Yeah, no, and this is one of the things that at least 2 of the radio show hosts, because I've been on right-wing talk radio a bunch over the last couple of weeks, right? And at least 2 of the radio show hosts brought up an article. They didn't tell me who it was. It's probably the same one, right? Where one of them was Jesse Lee Peterson. The other one was, I forget who. But they said, they go through all of this stuff to make it so that you have to ask permission at every part of the sexual encounter, every stage, right? You have to ask permission. Can I do this? Can I do that? Is it okay if I do this? Are you okay if I do that? And then they write articles saying that turns them off, that makes them, turned off, and they don't want that. And he's like, what is with these women? And I'm just saying, like, yeah, no, it's because they think that they want something, and they may actually genuinely, sincerely believe that they want a specific thing in a man. But then when they get it, it's just like, oh, this sucks. Right?
That's actually kind of a general female behavior. Did either one of you grow up in a devoutly religious home where you went to church or anything?
No, never.
Okay,
never.
So I did.
I didn't.
And did you?
No, not at
okay.
all. My parents were both something atheists. I think my father might be a Zoroastrian, but he says he sometimes says things just because.
Well,
he's trolling, so I don't know if he really is a Zoroastrian or if he's just trolling me.
So I'm the only one that's seen it from the church perspective, but this is something that women do. They are very, they have a tendency to moralize, like you would proselytize, but they moralize, and then after they moralize, they go out and do exactly the opposite thing, and it's on this idea that if they enjoy something, if they like something, if they want something, it's more exciting if it's forbidden, and it's more exciting It's kind of like when with men thrill seeking through danger. That's women's way of thrill seeking through danger. Oh, drinking is bad. I'm going to secretly drink, but I'm going to tell everybody drinking is bad. And riding a motorcycle is dangerous and bad, but I'm going to do that in secret too. And I'm going to wear ankle length skirts only in church and say that showing your legs off is really slutty. But then I'm going to go out on the weekend dancing in a miniskirt. And, this is, you see that all the time. You see it with, not every church, but you do see it in churches. You'll see it in, especially like groups that have, more of a, not necessarily a charismatic, but a pious kind of charismatic style where, people testify in church and there's tent revivals and stuff like that. And I've seen it in feminism. I got dragged to a couple of Take Back the Night rallies by an old friend of me, and I just can't call somebody that takes me to one of those things my friend. But in any case, it was the same kind of thing. The women would talk about stuff. They would call it rapey and harassment, and they would call it imposing and objectifying and all those different condemnations of male interest in women, but they still sought it every time, every chance they got, every time they went out, every day in class. They'd still dress to draw the eye and so on. And that's a typical female thing, and I think it's partly related to that same thing that guys do with thrill seeking through danger and risk taking. That's female risk taking. The other end of it is probably more to do with the fact of social control. This I have control over. Nobody's allowed to do it, but if I do it on my own quietly and secretly, it's just mine. And it's like it makes it special for them. But it's something that I've noticed quite a bit, and it's not just in that area, but a really good sort of joking example-y type description of it is in Ray Stevens' Mississippi Squirrel Revival, when he sings about this squirrel this kid brings to church, and it gets loose and wreaks havoc on the congregation, and there's this moment where it goes, as he says, down to the amen pew where sat Miss Bertha Better Than You, and when it goes up her skirt, it scares the crap out of her, and she starts confessing to sins that would make a sailor red with shame. This is such a typical phenomenon that it's made pop culture. You see it on television, you see it in movies. It's a regular thing, and it's not necessarily 100% all of it bad or malicious or nefarious or anything like that. It's just that if you let it get to a dysfunctional level where people start listening and agreeing and taking women at their word at every little syllable, when they sound off like that, and then live by it, it's going to be very frustrating to them later when they can't have any fun because they told everybody that fun is bad.
Well, I think you make a good point, and like I'm going to use Alexander Kolpakov. Is that what his name is? Russian Deadpool, as sort of an example of something like this phenomenon. And I think that Harvey Weinstein, who was like super pro-feminist, and a whole bunch of other people in sort of the progressive feminist media, right? So many of the people who have been, outed by Me Too as being scumbags, and I'm not gonna judge them before, like, as far as I'm concerned, it all might be bullshit. But I do think that there is a tendency for people who have certain proclivities, certain tendencies, to latch on to ideologies that, particularly if they know that those are harmful, or if they have some sort of shame around them, to latch on to the ideologies that condemn those things, right? And so if you actually are not comfortable as a woman going out in a short skirt and getting all that male attention, if you do actually have conflicting psychology around your decision to do that, as the preacher's daughter or whatever, right? You might go out and do that and then be like act super morally superior to everybody else in church, right? And pretend that you can do no wrong and that you've never even seen a miniskirt in your life. And I think that maybe, I don't think, and a lot of people sort of were speculating, what the hell is it with feminism? Does it teach these men to rape? I don't think so. I think that men who have certain proclivities may be attracted to the feminist narrative, whether it's because feminism's narrative essentially gives them a buffet of vulnerable, weak women who can't and shouldn't be expected to say no or defend themselves, who are constantly talking about how vulnerable they are, and who can't get off the topic of rape, right? Which would be, if I were a sexual predator, exactly where I want to be, is amongst these women, hearing them talk about all this shit, right? And then taking advantage of that. Or maybe you're somebody with certain tendencies that you want to suppress, because you understand that they're not good, right? And so you go to an ideology that gives you either the sort of we have the instruction manual on how to suppress those tendencies, right? Just come in, learn about rape culture and how she fears you and all of that stuff. Like, come on in and we'll help you, right? It's either that, or it's an offer of really, this isn't about you as an individual, right? Okay, so maybe you raped a woman, or maybe you want to rape women, or maybe you are a controlling guy within your relationships and you're jealous and controlling and abusive, right? But that's not actually you doing those things. That's masculinity doing that. That's the culture that you were immersed in, right? And you really can't help yourself, and it has nothing to do with you. These are the lessons you learned as a boy and absorbed as a boy. You absorbed the cultural misogyny, and so you're only doing what all other men do. So that narrative normalizes the behavior so that these guys don't feel, the guys who feel guilty about engaging in that behavior don't feel quite so guilty, right? And
well,
so
they can feel more like men. They can feel more like men.
Yeah.
That's what's tying them to other men, is this kind of
yeah. That's what makes a real man, don't you know, under a patriarchy, is beating your wife and raping her, right? So like that's all smiled upon under patriarchy. Like, there was never a patriarchy at all that outlawed beating your wife or raping her.
Well, just think about how that must feel, Like, a real man beats and rapes his wife. That's what makes you masculine. You see that so the rapists and the wife beaters are the most masculine men in the world, and all of the other men just wish they had the balls to do what those rapists and wife beaters do. That's what feminism teaches men, and the guys who don't do that, of course, are less masculine. They're feminized somehow.
Well, and I think that's part of why, like, you see in the younger end of feminism, the college age and the high school age end of feminism, you see a lot more male feminists. And then when you get to the older, the feminist crowd you're looking at is the less testosterone you see in that crowd, in either sex, because they don't stay in the movement, they don't stay in the ideology, because it doesn't jive with what they see in life and what they know in life and what's going on inside. And
well, it's emasculating.
Constantly, it's emasculating, but it's also, you start to see that it doesn't jive with real life. And I can't tell you how many former male feminists I've talked to that were feminist in high school, they were feminist in college, and they remained feminist until they started to try to reconcile the beliefs with what was happening in their lives and how the people around them behaved and how they themselves, their own attitudes, their own internal thought processes and all of that. And they just couldn't reconcile. There was too much cognitive dissonance, and they began, looking around for other information. And, a lot of them found anti-feminist writing, a lot of them found men's issues discussion and everything, but a lot of them just simply said, this is crap. It's not true. I'm not buying into it anymore. I'm done.
Well, I think too, a lot of the men that are attracted to the feminist movement are men who actually do, like, who either were bullied by other boys all their lives, right? Because they were nerdy or geeky or, small or effeminate or whatever. So they were either bullied, or they misinterpreted some of the roughness of boys as bullying, because boys do bully. So do girls, right? Boys and girls both engage in bullying, but a lot of what gets described as bullying these days is actually instinctive testing behavior on the part of groups of boys, right? Yeah, you can join us. We're going to test you, right? We're going to test you, see if you can hack it, right? See if you can be valuable to the group. See if you can, tolerate it, right? And when you pass the test and you're in, it can be very unpleasant, the particular test, but once you pass the test and you're in, you're often in, right? And you're part of the group, and then you get to enjoy all of that loyalty and all of those sort of inner tribalistic in-group feelings of belonging and everything else, right? But what I think a lot of young men, particularly young men who have been sheltered, who have had helicopter parents, or who have been, raised in such a way that they've been sheltered from any kind of conflict with anybody else that isn't an adult to mediate it for you. So essentially, every boy in school these days, right, the go-to response is go get an adult to mediate the conflict for you rather than deal with it yourself, which I think is actually not a good way to go, but that's how they do it now.
It's so bad that you're deemed having been in a fight if somebody punches you, even if you don't hit them back.
Yeah, and so essentially what you have is this situation where a lot of these men who really couldn't stand up to masculine culture are extremely attracted, and they see masculine culture in and of itself, all aspects of it, as bullying. And they get attracted to the toxic masculinity narrative. And, like, one of the best examples of it, and I should actually put little notations on my video, 25 Men Bullshitting About Male Privilege, that Jonathan McIntosh production, right? About male privilege in gaming, male advantages in gaming. And just like put little notations guessing the testosterone level of each of the men, because I don't think that I think that they all probably have the testosterone levels of 70 to 80-year-old men, just judging by their phenotypical morphology, their physical morphology, like narrow shoulders, long necks, just very, very, like, these are the men, right, who are like, yeah, we can't hack masculine culture. They're the fish, right? Or the seals,
okay,
the
guys.
sea lions, sea lions
who really off topic.
Yeah,
who take on a female phenotype so that they can sneak in and get sex.
Well,
okay.
And like this is what we ran into, just to bring it back to the men's rights subreddit. This is a spectrum of stuff that we ran into. You saw young men recovering from feminist ideology that didn't fit that group. You saw men and women having men's issues discussion. You saw feminists coming in to shame the men for having men's issues discussion and try to reel the women in with, you have internalized soggy knees and all of that crap. And we basically saw this environment where, despite all of the opposition to unadulterated discussion of the issues, to this knockdown, drag out, this is the way things are discussion, and this is what's needed discussion. And, you know, it's even the people on the same side were not all in agreement on how to handle everything, because you have a variety of perspectives. But we did realize that there had to be this this voice, this opening, where men's issues could be discussed by men without men getting judged for it. And we realized that the thing that was going to happen, that have to happen to pave the way for that, because women were always going to shame them for it. There's always going to be women calling it misogynistic to acknowledge that women can be just as violent as men can. Calling it misogynistic to acknowledge that it hurts when women mistreat men. And so we realized there would have to be women standing up for men's right to say those things. And the best way to stand up for that was to also say them ourselves, and to point out that saying these things is not wrong. Analyzing them is important. Dealing with the issues is important. And turning around and shutting them up because it's offensive to the sensibilities of people who take everything personally is reprehensible. And it's not that all, to be honest, it's not that all feminist men are low testosterone, because I've run into I've run into men that become feminist because they see it as a way of protecting the women they love and care about. A lot of people go into it as a misguided thing. And there had to be a voice that they're not going to listen to other men say that feminism is bad. There had to be a voice out there that was female saying, no, this isn't necessary. You don't have to condemn other men to protect women. And that sort of led us all to start working together on different projects. I think the first thing that I did with Alison was, you recruited me, Alison, for A Voice for Men, actually, when I started writing for A Voice for Men, because Alison asked me to, I had posted on a topic on Reddit, and I can't even remember what the first topic I posted on was, but I posted a bunch of information on a topic, and she asked me to write an article on that topic for A Voice for Men, and that got me started writing regularly, and that's what I was doing when Alison started Honey Badger Radio, was writing regularly for A Voice for Men.
Yeah, no, me too. Like with, I think I was doing A Voice for Men Radio with John the Other, and I had written a few articles for A Voice for Men, but they really wanted me on the radio on Thursday nights with John the Other, and then we often brought Alison in as our, he called it our floating co-host. So that was sort of how we developed a bit of a rapport in terms of, you know, sort of being voices rather than text, you know, voices in the ear rather than text on a screen. And that was, I think, where I realized that, okay, yeah, no, I actually want to continue to, and then we brought in Hannah, I believe, on a couple of episodes too, didn't we?
Actually, I don't think I got on, I don't think I did anything on A Voice for Men Radio until I started with Alison's idea of Honey Badger Radio.
Yeah, we took over the Thursday show right after John the Other had to leave because of work issues and stuff. And so it was essentially presented to us that we could have the Thursday night slot, Alison and I, and then we brought you on. And yeah,
Alison contacted me and asked if I wanted to be involved, and I had done college radio years ago, And it was intriguing and at the same time a little intimidating because I get stage fright, and it's just one of those things you have to overcome. But
I do
but
remember.
yeah.
I do remember you actually had some stage fright in the beginning. I was always, because, and it was really like what I liked about Blog Talk Radio was that you phoned in, right? Or at least I phoned in with my phone. So it was like essentially having a phone conversation. So I didn't have that stage fright. I didn't have any of that because it was just like talking on the phone. And that's actually, yeah. So it was that I just fell right into sort of doing the radio show, doing that, you know, and the discussions that go, you know, I remember when John was hosting, him having to say to me and Alison, okay, let's just drag the discussion kicking and screaming back on topic, because she and I would go off on these tangents. Yeah, and go in, you know, into the weeds, into the rhubarb, and you know, and we still do, of course. But yeah, no, I mean, like, it's just been it's been a wonderful experience, actually. My entire interaction with the two of you has just been really, really valuable to me, and I just wanted to. This is probably going to be the only, and I'm probably in the grip of some kind of weird female hormone right now. But I just want to let you know that I really appreciate you both.
See, this is wonderful. Very much
also,
so. Men do this when they're drunk. Women do it because they're female.
I love you, man.
I love you, man.
No homo. I'm
starting to feel sort of cringy.
I know.
Also, one thing I want to say is, from now on, Hannah, I want you to introduce me the way Max does.
How does he introduce you?
She who must be obeyed.
I refuse.
God damn it.
Okay, all right. I want to actually drag it back a bit, because we've jumped ahead in the timeline.
Yeah.
We talked about how we got into men's rights, and then we talked about how we met each other on Reddit. I don't know if Karen actually met you on Reddit.
Yeah.
Did you meet her on Reddit?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. In fact,
one of the things that, like, you were an Aeroscript. I was like, who the fuck is this, and how the fuck do you pronounce that?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that was essentially, you know, you had these long, detailed comments, right?
Full of links to everything on the internet.
Yeah, full of links.
As one feminist put it.
You know,
I'm not reading everything on the internet. I'm just gonna not believe what you said. Out of hand.
Zero, like, almost zero emotiveness, just like pure information, right? And like, whereas Alison often, at least in the early days when I encountered her on Reddit, she came off as sometimes angry, dismissive, you know, flippant, rightfully so, right? Only when appropriate. But you know, she didn't tend to leave these big walls of text with like a million links, right? And you left these huge walls of text, right, that were completely unemotional, just pure information, pure logic, and then links to back everything up. And I was just like, oh God, this bitch has more energy than I do. So, you know, it was like, you know, either that or she's got some, like, you know, file somewhere where she keeps all of these things, you know, handy for exactly when, and including paragraphs written out for exactly when she needs them. Because God damn it.
My computer that got struck by lightning, I lost 4,000 bookmarks.
Oh God.
Yeah, I was like, I now back up my bookmarks.
You must have, like, cried and
but
grieved.
Not too hard, because I wasn't sitting at the computer when it got struck by lightning, and I could have been. So
all right,
I lost them. I recovered a lot of my bookmarks. I recovered the most important ones. But yeah, that's basically the way I do things. The way I approach things is, okay, what is true? How can we analyze what is true? What does it mean? You know, and then you go from there, and you can't really get emotional about what is true, because then you don't figure out why. it's true.
Yeah.
And you never figure out the cause behind the problem, and you can't solve the problem. And I don't really see it any different than getting upset by the numbers in a mathematical equation. You know, like, oh my gosh, I hate 5. 5 is evil. You can't have a mathematical equation with 5 in it. Well, now you can never solve for x if there's a 5 in your mathematical equation. You now can't do math. You know.
Yeah, no, it's I agree. I completely agree in terms of like trying to keep things unemotional. I mean, there are times when I get emotional for sure.
There are times when I get emotional too. Like there were times when I get very, very irate, and I get very, very frustrated and sad and things like that. Especially when dealing with these issues. There are things when I researched for the article on gender disparity in criminal court, I got sick. There was no separating the emotion from it. I couldn't do it. I got sick. The fact that these things are true is sickening, but you still have to look at them from a factual standpoint. This is true. How do we solve it? This is the problem. How do we solve it? These are happening, and these are the social tendencies, and this is where they came from. You can still get mad. You can still get upset, but you still have to deal with the problem. That probably came from having, as a kid, to learn to separate the panic that happens when you suffocate from the experience of suffocation, so I could deal with it. Because if you don't deal with it, it goes to completion and you die, and you have to be able to use your inhaler. You have to be able to tell an adult, you know, that this is happening and you need help, and you have to be able to make it to the hospital. You have to be able to try to get what control you can over your breathing. And you can't do any of that if you let panic take over. And so you have to like set your panic over here on the side, and you can still feel it. You just can't let it be in charge. And it has to be the same way with, you know, somebody has said in this forum that women can with a single lie can wreck a man's entire life. And that cuts, you know, right to the core. If you're female and you think, you know, I could be that evil, I could something I have the capacity to do could hurt somebody that badly, you don't want to think that about yourself. But if you don't deal with why that happens and how to protect the guy, you just leave that situation to fester.
Well, with me, like I never had problems with generalizations about men and women. You know, like as you/Demon Spawn has said over and over and over again, right? Generalities exist. To believe that no one is an exception makes you a bigot. To believe everyone is an exception makes you an idiot. Mm-hmm. You know, like there are some behaviors that tend to be characteristic of women, some behaviors that tend to be characteristic of men. And, you know, so one of the things that I never had a problem with was, you know, because I could actually look when somebody was saying, you know, well, women do this, women do that. And I would look and I would say, well, do I do that? No, I actually don't do that. Right. And sometimes I said, yes, actually, I really do that. Right. Like I am really that quintessential, you know, woman who likes a dominant man in bed. Right. Like the one. All of the women who buy all of the romance novels, right? Because that's what gets them off, is the alpha male hero with the, you know, who takes what he wants from his, you know, the woman that he's got his eye on, and he, you know, he proves himself to her, but he also rips her bodice, right? And all of that stuff, right? Like all of that shit turns me on, absolutely 100%. Might not be the same for Alison, but I can admit that, you know, I don't want to be with a man who lies back and says, I want you to like horsewhip me or something. Like I would be like, okay, go to a sex worker, please. You know,
I can't pick up a horse.
Because I'm I'm
All right.
so not into that.
That kind
But,
of leads us.
I mean-
That kind of leads us into that. What Factory wrote. Factory's the one that they castigated in the men's right or in the Lady MRA
Okay.
subreddit.
Maybe a little bit
That
of context,
Alison
though.
was.
A little bit of context. Like once again, we're back on Reddit. All three of us have sort of met up, or we're just sort of passed in the night. Karen obviously thought I was very dismissive, which I might have been, because there was a point in time where I was just getting really freaking tired with people's.
You were just very short
walls.
with people.
You were
short
succinct.
with people.
I would say succinct. Things
Yeah,
were stated
short.
in a very succinct manner that did not coddle people's potential
You
emotional
didn't
response
handhold
to it.
anybody. You didn't handhold anybody, and that was really what struck me about the first comments that I found of yours.
Yeah.
I don't cotton people's polite fictions about themselves. Oh boy, has that got me in trouble throughout my life. Okay, yeah, and then Karen also noticed Hannah's great walls and walls of text. She's gonna erect the wall to keep the feminists out. Okay, because they're not sending their best. Yeah, so we were just in Reddit, and we just been sort of noticing each other, but not really, hooking up or anything. And then Factory happened. And Factory was a men's rights activist. He's a friend of mine. He actually, I've actually met him in person several times, and he got into an altercation. First of all, the first thing that he did, which was interesting, was he was singing the praises of Lady MRAs, the subreddit. I remember that. And then he ended up talking about MGTOW, giving them a really, really honest, like no holds barred, honest answer to why men were starting to embrace MGTOW, men going their own way movement, which is essentially avoiding relationships with women, avoiding women as much as possible, not wanting to get in a position where they are subject to the laws around family court and all of the other stuff, domestic violence. And he gave them a no holds barred explanation. And he did so, I think, because they may have asked for it.
Well, what happened was it came up in discussion, and a statement was made that was basically a question, but they later denied that it was a question. But, yeah.
So they essentially asked him to explain it, and he did. And he pulled no punches. Now, for me, like Karen was saying, being in that's a form of respect. You just tell it as it is. You don't sugarcoat it. You don't just tell it as it is. Just rip that freaking bandage off and just give it as it is.
I read his post and I was like, no, all of that seems pretty legit, and you come across as a bit angry, but justifiably so.
Do you have the actual post, Hannah?
I do. Let me find there's the Hunting for Archetypes post itself, the blog itself here, which I will link in our chat, and then I'm actually going to switch to, let's see, a different, that's got the empty chair in it. Let's just toss out the empty chair.
I have no idea what you're.
Oh, it's in the broadcast. And let me see if I can open up. And what I've got there, actually in the window, is not going to be the post in question, because I actually did
a search on Lady MRAs, and I can't actually find the original post.
No, it's like the post got shadow banned. I really had to look, but I've got all of the I've got some links, and so I'm going to show some things in the broadcast. I believe this is the one that I have up on the screen.
This is definitely, I think, the moment that me, Karen, and Hannah met.
Yeah.
Was in this kerfuffle, this confrontation between Factory and the Lady MRAs, after they had asked him a question and he answered why men were going were becoming MGTOW, why they were going their own way.
Well, I mean, they asked a question along the same lines as that panelist asked a question. I just don't understand why, it's not okay for women to be into comic books in the minds of some of these MRA types, right? That kind of question.
Yeah. that kind of thing. They don't think of it as them asking a question, but in reality, that's exactly what they're doing. They're asking a question, and they didn't like the answer. So yeah, I'm going to read the question. I'm going to read the question. Now, what he had done, the post itself is pretty cut and dried. It's mostly just descriptive. There really wasn't anything in it that I saw that I thought, gosh, this is horribly offensive. But maybe it's because I've seen men go through what he was talking about. But his first response that he got was, do you feel like, well, it wasn't the first one, it was one of the responses from one of the mods. Do you feel like you lack respect for all women? This is what set me off right there. Do you feel like you lack respect for all women? Oh my God. And what about your coworkers, family members? Do you see game or PUA as the only responsible way to approach reproduction? I can't condone any generalization which includes all men, all Mexicans, all gays, or all women. Now, he didn't make any generalizations like that. He used group names, but he never said all anybody. This is all pretty foreign to me. I appreciate your input, but I guess I don't understand what it is you think women should do. And, I mean, he gave a pretty long response to this, but it wasn't him being angry. He described here, my 25-ish-year-old coworkers have, for the most part, sworn off women completely. This is a statement of fact. It's not women are bad. This is what is happening. One is in a highly controlling relationship, though. Blue pill guy, if I ever saw one. The mid-20s guys that swore off women all did so because they were fucked over, abused, and left holding the bag. All of them. This is what he's talking about, what he's describing. He's not talking about women being bad people. He's talking about men's experiences. And he basically turned the answer around on them. I see game as the only reasonable way to approach women and politics. Game is about understanding women and instilling a backbone and some pride back into men. PUAs are the entry point, the how can I get chicks path. That is really how can I not be so soul-destroyingly lonely. PUA is the fast food approach to relationships. Game theory is the 5-star cooking instruction. So he was not talking about this as a way to undermine women's ability to say no, or anything like that. He was talking about it as a way to get around the barriers that keep men and women from connecting with each other and communicating. And it's, I don't know, it's just, this whole thing, this was the start. Until men learned that it's not only okay but necessary to stand against women's interests once in a while, this is what turns women on, sort of, rather than supplication. Well, they'll keep shoveling entitlements women's way, hoping to earn their approval. This is where the generalizations thing comes in. Generalizations exist for a reason, and using the term women is not invalid if it can be accurately generally applied. And let's be honest, most of the time when people object to mass characterization is because they themselves refuse to self-identify as a perpetrator of any of the injustices or double standards in question. And they went on to demonstrate that. It's funny, but I've never seen an article written by a woman admitting to shitty behavior and apologizing for it sincerely without trying in some way to shift the blame from herself. The refusal to admit wrongdoing is a famous stereotype applied to women, and I myself can't think of a single instance in media or personal life where a woman ever anywhere admitted to being a shit and apologized sincerely. Now, I'm fortunate when it comes to attracting women, so I've had quite a bit of experience with a varied cast of characters, yet this seems to be a universal only among women, or seems to be universal only among women. Men routinely and readily admit when they're wrong, for the most part, unless, for example, it would diminish his status or income to admit it. Is it then unfair for me to say women don't admit when they're wrong? I'm prolific, sure, but do you think I personally created that stereotype? Obviously not. So the large amount of people agreeing with my lived experience needed to create a stereotype denotes widespread occurrence. Ergo, women don't admit when they're wrong is a fair statement to make, in my view. Does that make sense? And the last bit in response to this is all pretty foreign to me. Personally, I think women are fucked, and not in the good way. I think men have been severely marginalized as a matter of law and policy, and when they realize that, there will be hell to pay. I think men will also see why these things happen to them, and they will place safeguards in place, making repetition impossible. They will create social mores belittling concern for women as overcompensation for the white knights that sold men down the river. And this will likely result in very harsh social restriction and criticism of women at every turn. Slut culture has demonstrated to men that if they want reassurance their wives aren't stepping out, that their children are really theirs, that they don't have to live in constant worry he'll end up as a cuckold, about the only thing they can do is turn women into virtual prisoners, a la Middle East. And they will do it for no other reason than to avoid a demographic collapse. I think backlash against domestic violence and divorce law will see a complete reversal, with the patriarch given absolute authority in response to overly authoritarian government intrusion in the past, and we may even see the creation of ownership of women. Depends on how shitty things get. Remember, we are talking about 3.5 billion people here, give or take. That's a big ship, and it takes a long time to turn it around. For instance, we are seeing just now the results of reforms instituted in the 1980s, from education to reproductive rights to unilateral divorce, and those reforms were a result of lobbying years earlier. Things will get much worse before they get better, and that's if we got it. That's if we got to it today, which we're not going to do. So what should women do? Work like a bugger to soften the blow, to rectify as much as you can whenever and wherever you can, to view men as human beings and to recognize, oh God, I hope you finally recognize just how much anger and pain and fear and resentment there is among men these days. And they didn't get it. I'm not going to go through and read every post because this was a very long discussion. But she went through and basically demonized men in response to this. The one sentence in here that really got me is, gay men will tell you how much men suck, as will straight women. You know what? Gay men joke about that, but if they thought men sucked in a bad way, they wouldn't be gay. Or they wouldn't be interested.
They'd be gay and
asexual. Yeah, they'd be asexual. They wouldn't have a sexuality. And this is something that it's not like it went over their heads. This was what we watched happen, was information being made available. And the women who had ample opportunity to take in the information.
Not just ample opportunity. Who said we are lady MRAs?
Yeah, this was
are for men. We are pro male. We have your backs as MRAs. We have your backs as men discussing men's experience.
And they had ample opportunity to take this information in and use it to shape their activism and use it to grow as people. And they pissed on it and then buried their heads in the sand to avoid it. And I'm going to switch to, let's see if this is, yeah. Okay, so then we have...
Can I just interject briefly?
Yeah.
I think the demarcation, the line between the two groups is willing to submit to being judged and taking responsibility for those judgments. Now, there are things in Factory's post that I disagree with. I disagree with his some of his predictions, but
yeah, me
too. On the other hand, I do agree with the fact that he's holding women to a standard of women's behavior to a standard of accountability and responsibility. And I agree to submit to that judgment, to receive the results of that judgment. And if I fail to live up to that standard, to attempt to do better in the future. And I think that's really where the line is drawn. There are some women who are willing to allow men to step into that position of being able to judge them morally and say, you are a moral actor. These are the things that hurt me. These are the things that hurt men. This is what you need to take responsibility for, and this is what you need to prove. There are women who are willing to say that part of my identity, not the whole identity, like not my whole identity isn't judgment by men, but part of my identity is being judged in terms of how I help and prevent myself and try to prevent or encourage other women to not hurt men. I submit to that. I submit to that judgment. And in submitting to that judgment, I develop myself as a moral agent. It's like you can't grow without a standard to grow to. If you don't have a measuring stick, how do you have growth? There's no way. So in submitting to that judgment, I separate myself necessarily from the female people, women who say they're interested in men's rights, who don't want to submit to the judgment, don't want to say there's a part of me that wishes to seek to be responsible to men and responsible for their hurts and responsible for their vulnerabilities and trying to do something to help them when they are hurt and vulnerable. But as I submit to that, it allows me to grow as a person and as an individual, understanding my effect on the world around me. There's a benefit to this. There's a huge benefit to it because you get a sense of power.
Well, okay.
Responsibility with the sense of responsibility.
Why does Jordan Peterson's message resonate with so many, stop it, dog, so many young men and so few young women? Is because he talks about, okay, take responsibility. First thing you do, take responsibility for yourself and your immediate surroundings. Then take responsibility for other people, your immediate family. Then take responsibility for your community, right? And all of that, right? And somehow this message, he's like literally saying, take responsibility for other people who are not you, right? And he's getting massive feedback, positive feedback from young men in particular, right? Why is this message completely lost on young women? Why are there so few young women who this message resonates with, right? Like, why? Because as far as they're concerned, they're not responsible for anybody.
I think it's fear.
There's
this. You want my honest answer? I think it's fear.
There's a sensibilities issue too, though.
Your young women are afraid to grow up and be where the buck stops. Because when you step into that role of taking responsibility of men, recognizing and taking responsibility for men's pain and their vulnerability, you have to let go of this vision of men as all powerful and the alpha and omega of society and your world. And that is, I think that for a lot of women and girls, that is excruciating. The idea that they are actually equal partners, in some cases, even more powerful partners than men. It is a horrifying idea, and they run from it. They run from their power, from perception.
They're not running from their power. They're running from accountability.
Yeah, yes. And there's another aspect to that too. When you have responsibility, when you are accountable to others and for others, you are no longer the most important person. And this may be partly biological. In fact, it probably is because of the way women had to be valued throughout history due to their reproductive importance. But I think it's also cultural. Girls are raised with the idea they're special. They're taught that they're important, that they're unique. You can be anything you want. and everything is about you, and you grow up with this. You hear ladies first as a girl just as often as boys do. And I've talked about, in response to the emotional labor thing, what must that do to hear ladies first, hear the opposite sex first all of your life? Imagine hearing you first. You get the serving first. You go out the door first. You come before everybody else. You are protected. You are provided for. You are cared for. You are loved. You must be royalty. And the moment you have to recognize the power of your accountability, the moment you have to recognize that you have the power to be responsible, and you have the power to affect things, and you have the power to impact things, and the responsibility to be mindful of how you use that and the impact of it and so on, you're not the most important person in the world. It matters if you hurt someone. It matters if you screw up. It matters if you're wrong. And if that becomes a new thing for a woman, and she's never had that when she was growing up, where she's never been castigated on the level that a boy gets castigated if he does harm to another person, then it becomes a terrifying prospect, because there's no protocol for dealing with it. If you don't grow up in a family where if you break somebody's window, your dad takes you over and says, my daughter threw that ball, and she's going to volunteer to do chores at your house, or I will give you money to fix the window and she can volunteer to do extra chores at my house, whichever you prefer, until that window is paid for. If you don't grow up with that degree of accountability, and you don't see your mother taking that same level of responsibility, and your grandmother and your aunts, and then all of a sudden some guy comes along and talks to you as if it is in your nature to have that level of accountability, it must be a completely alien and terrifying thing. It must feel like being dumped in the middle of the ocean and told to swim. And I think a lot of women react to it very much like a cat that was dumped into the middle of the ocean and told to swim. And I think that's probably a very big part of it. Now, I'm not saying that all girls grow up with zero accountability, but it's very obvious in society that boys have a higher degree of accountability and a lower degree of being given messages about their importance as human beings than girls do. And that combination, it changes the way they respond to criticism in a way that is very different than the way girls respond to criticism. And I think girls could actually do with a little bit more of what boys get. And there are other areas. I think male suicide, the increases, and whether you want to call it an epidemic or whether you simply want to call it a problem, I think boys aren't getting enough messages about their importance as human beings. And so that gap needs to be narrowed. But we're to a point where, since I have to work tonight, I'm gonna have to cut off the show, and we're gonna have to continue discussing the Reddit end of things. Just when it got interesting, we're gonna have to continue discussing the Reddit end of things next week. So we'll pick up next week where we have left off here with we got involved in the Lady MRA's dust up. I'm gonna read this, I believe, was Doc's post. By next week, when I put this up on the thing, and I'm just going to read the first couple of paragraphs, because I think this post was actually, I can read the whole thing, and then when we come back, I'll read it again, and we can talk about how we entered in and responded and everything, and we'll go on from there. But, and I should be able to find, there's like an unreddit or no Reddit or something like that that'll actually put people's names back in there. But this was the post. This was posted in the men's rights. No, this was not posted in the men's rights subreddit. This was the post to MR. Oh, it was linked in the men's rights subreddit. And it was basically, come in here and deal with our shit. So this was to MR. And she wrote, "So you might have noticed that things got a little ugly around here lately. It's unfortunate, but sadly not unexpected. In fact, I'm kind of surprised it didn't happen sooner. I know that there are women at our men's rights, but for now I'm going to speak to the men." And so right away she's dismissing us. "I know that a lot of you have been fucked by the system, have had your kids, your livelihoods, and your rights taken away. I understand that you're pissed. We started this subreddit quite honestly because we felt like there needed to be a place for women to learn about and discuss men's issues. A lot of women in our age group have never heard anything about it and have been indoctrinated to believe that men have no issues. This is a place for them to start, or the place for them to start isn't our men's rights, which has been made abundantly clear in the past 24 hours. There's too much hostility for anyone to learn anything. I hear what you're saying about not wanting to be told how to express your anger. Our men's rights is the right place to do it. If you want to express it here, feel welcome to do so. But here, you're going to have to do it in a more constructive way. We're not going to allow anyone to be called whores or be told to shut their fucking mouths. If you don't feel like you can do that, then don't come here. Everyone is welcome here, even feminists. If you can't deal with that, don't come here. If you've got your mind made up that women are shitty people by nature, don't come here. We're not going to deny history because it doesn't support our opinions. If you don't understand that, don't come here. Men's rights isn't supposed to replace feminism. It's supposed to be better than feminism. It's supposed to be about the truth. If that bothers you, don't come here. Personally, I'd like to see as many people here as possible, with as many opinions as possible. But even if it ends up with absolutely no one here, it's definitely preferable to the backbiting shithole we saw yesterday. Edit. Just going to wrap this one up. Long story short, if you think behavior that we saw yesterday and criticized is in any way normal, justified, or okay, then you don't belong here. We'll keep trying to bring attention to MR, but we're not listening to that shit or having it here." So that was basically her response, was to lecture like an angry mother. Didn't bother listening, didn't bother evaluating what she saw, just lectured. And that was what brought us into the discussion. That post was posted, was linked to the men's rights subreddit. We read it, and we went to see what the brouhaha was. And that's your cliffhanger, to be continued. I'm going to go ahead and read the super chats, which I have to scroll back to, because there's actually a lot in our chat here. Let's see. Okay. So we missed the first one. The first one was from Joey Jojo, and I do not remember how much, but I do remember that he said he is no longer an incel, that he basically started interacting and apparently has a girlfriend now. So
are you sure those are the chats from tonight?
That was from tonight. I okay. Saw it pop up on the screen, and it was gone before I could copy it. So I don't know the whole. I don't have the exact words, but I'm sure it's at the beginning of the video.
Oh, you know how you get the exact words? Just navigate to the events. You know the sausage maker that I call the screen, the live event.
Well, I don't even have that stuff open anywhere on my, so I would actually have to, yeah, I'm not gonna do that because I do not have time. Xeranx gave us $2 and said, "Karen, where's the Bill Burr response video? Was making dinner and playing with Vive Pro, so I didn't realize the time. Here now."
That's actually Andrew. That's Andrew's comment.
That's Andrew's comment. No, the Bill Burr response video has been sidelined until further notice.
Well, yeah, don't put that stuff in with the super. We have a bunch of super chats that are just cash and no. Because we have Rico Champagne gave us $1 Canadian and didn't say anything. Then now Anthony Durrell did have a message. Anthony Durrell gave us $5 and said, "Gender Attic is pretty important to HBR and what it does now. Has it been brought up? I'm late to this." And yes, it was. It was discussed actually very early on. And then let's see.
I actually didn't bring it up, so I don't think we have discussed it.
Yeah. It was mentioned in your monologue.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
And Darren Hightower III gave us $2 Canadian. Thank you for that. Hoki Bukisa gave us $4.20 and said, "Bingo, Hannah." That came through when I was talking about the difference between how we teach girls about their value and their importance, and how we teach boys about their value and their importance. And that was all of our super chats. And with that, I am going to thank all of my co-hosts. I'm going to thank Andrew for capturing the super chats. And then also, you know, like, razz him for posting text right where it would look like it was a super chat when it wasn't. But I'm going to thank all of our cohorts in the background, everyone who helps make Honey Badger live streams happen, and all of our listeners. Thanks for being patient with the long show, and hopefully our little trip down memory lane has been interesting, because we're going to continue it next week. And with that, I will say to you all, good night.